I better do an introduction because otherwise I'm just going to keep talking about it and there'll be much more editing. So hi everyone, Jason here from spiritualbabies.net, joined by Rabbi Joshua Neely. You normally will be doing the Half Torah show right now, but we were talking about new ideas, and Rabbi Neely is already doing a series in his synagogue on the sages, and I was like, well, I can totally rip that off and and share it with our audience. So that's what we're going to do. Every week we're going to tackle one of the big names of Jewish learning. This week we are looking at RamBam. So first of all, thank you for giving your time on this project. I think that a lot of people will have heard the names of many of the people we're going to talk about thrown around, but we really don't know much about their lives, who they were, why they were amazing, and what they did for the Jewish people and for Torah study and for Talmud. So if you can maybe just start off by explaining why RamBam, why not his full name?
Well, Rambam sort of ended up becoming his full name, but his full name is actually Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. And for those of you that are very quick on anagrams or acronyms, you'll notice that Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, you take the first letter of each of those and you put in the ubiquitous ah sound. That's a default vowel for many Hebrew words. And out of the first letters of each of his parts of his name, you make the word Rambam. And indeed, many of the sages and scholars throughout rabbinic history have names that are all contractions of the title rabbi plus the rest of their name. And so you get Rashi, and you get Rashbam, and you get Radak, and you get Ralbag, and you get Ramban. And Ramban, who's Rabbi Moshe ben Maimonides, Nachman. So you're going to get a lot of names. It really fills up the encyclopedia in the R category. But it's important, as you're saying, to unpack the from the name and to see who the person was. Because these people were more than just the works that they created. And the works they created came out of a particular time period, a particular need, and a particular insight that they were sharing with the community. So yeah, it's more than just studying their works. It's also trying to see who they were played into this.
So he was Spanish, right? That was my first big surprise,
Mm-hmm.
was that he was Jewish but born in Spain. He was a Spanish person. That blew me away a little bit. I always had him down as because I know much of his life was spent in Egypt and in
Right.
kind of Central Asia, Morocco, and I had him down as that person, not as a European.
Well, I have no idea whether the European Union would call him European, but yes, he was born in Cordoba. He was born in Spain in 1135, and he was born during a relatively good period of Jewish-Islam coexistence in the Spanish peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, and during his youth, his father, who was Rabbi Maimon, was the dayan for the community, the leader for the community, and this was an amazingly rich cultural and intellectual environment for him to be growing up in. And it was one where he was able to get to know Islam very well, and get to know that there was a lot of room for cooperation and for co-learning. Indeed, many of the things that would later come out in his philosophical works and some of the impetus for his systemic analysis came from the style of work that was being done in the Muslim world. So we know that he was influenced and involved in those discussions across religious lines. The original move came because the Almohads, which was another group of Muslims, conquered Cordoba, and they were much, what we would call nowadays, they were much more fundamentalist. And so they began to force conversion to Islam. And Jews of that time took one of the three options that were available to us during different periods of repression like this, which is convert, pretend to convert, or leave. And Rambam's family chose the final. They chose to leave, and they went across to Morocco. And he lived there for quite some time. Again, there was a resurgence of religious pressure in Morocco. It's important to remember that the Muslim world was not monolithic at this time, any more than it is today. And different rulers would come and go, and different spirits of the day would come and go, that would influence which freedoms they would or wouldn't give to their minority populations. So when Fez began to experience an upsurge in this fundamentalism again, it was time to leave. And this time he went to Israel. A lot of people don't realize that RamBam lived in Israel for a short while. But the community in Israel was so poor, and in both sense of the words. It was both poor financially and very hard to make a living there, and also poor in terms of scholarship and intellectual culture. It was really off the beaten path of the Jewish scholarship trail at this point. It was really one of its low points in its history. And he really felt that he couldn't make a contribution there or make a real difference there, that he needed to be in the larger soup pot of Jewish thought and Jewish learning. And so he moved to Fustat, which is what we would call Cairo, and took up shop there. The family loss came when his brother David, who was the primary traveler for the family business, like many other Jewish families, especially those who had had to flee, most of the family business was tied up in movable capital, in this case gems, that allowed you to move and to sell without having to worry about having a giant warehouse that some emperor or king or caliph could simply take from you. But unfortunately, it wasn't a caliph that took this. David was on a long distance journey to sell gems, and the boat sank. And when the boat goes down with your brother and the boat goes down with your family fortune, you have to rebuild. So he was devastated. The record is that he was in a terrible depression for more than a year at the loss of his brother. And then he realized he really needed to pull himself together to help his family. And by family, I mean his extended family, his family, his brother's family. And so he decided to be a doctor, like any good Jewish boy, Jewish man at this point. And so he went and he read all the books about medicine in his day. And a couple months later, he became a doctor, which gives you something of his intellectual capability, and became an exceptionally good doctor who realized most of the books weren't worth the paper they were written on, and began to not only write a large number of books on Judaism, but wrote a huge number of medical books as well, in order to advance the theory of medicine in his day. And he was one of the big proponents of an early form of empiricism. He inherited much of the ancient idea of humors and the body balances and much, but he was also very keen on proper nutrition, proper exercise, and noticing what worked and what didn't, and trying to sort of figure that out. He lacked many of the modern tools of empirical medicine, but he was on the right track.
And philosophy, right? It wasn't just physical. He read and wrote on a lot of spiritual things too, which is going to bring us to some of this stuff later on. So he becomes the Saladin's vizier, or the Saladin's advisor. That would have been a huge position, right? That's like being the right-hand man to the president.
So there's some disagreement. Most of the official academic sources that I can find say that he was the official physician to the vizier of Saladin.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So that meant that he wasn't actually Saladin's doctor, which is sort of what the traditional shorthand has been used for him. It's what I was taught when I was in Hebrew school. But he was the doctor to the vizier, which meant that he also was the doctor to pretty much the rest of the palace. Which meant if there were anybody in the palace, any of the other servants, any of the other muckety-mucks that were ill, he would have to treat them. And when he talks about his day, he talks about waking up early in the morning, doing things that he can in the community, and going into the palace and spending the bulk of the day there, just treating and seeing all sorts of different people in the palace, and then coming home and taking care of the needs of the community. And then in the evening, on all through the night, basically doing his scholarly work. So this is someone who didn't get a lot of sleep.
So I know that when the tour that I was on with Rabbi Singer and Jonathan Truth to You last year, we were in Tiberias, and he's buried in Tiberias. His
Yes.
body was placed there when he died. I'm just wondering why Tiberias? If his family are from Spain and he didn't want to stay in Israel, and it just seems that was a strange choice.
Well, first of all, it was available in a way that many parts of Jerusalem, for example, were not available for Jewish burial at different times, depending upon who was in charge. Secondly, he was buried in the area where the great sages of the Mishnah were buried. And that really, although he's not remembered for it as prominently in the minds of most people, the Mishnah was his first true love, you might say. And it was the Mishnah that was really his inspiration for much of what he did in his life. And so to be buried near the other sages of the Mishnah made a great deal of sense. And to this day, when you go up to his tomb in Tiberias, you are seeing all along the side of the walkway that leads up the graves of others that are from the Mishnaic period. In some way, it's a shame that his tomb has been created in such an elaborate way that many of theirs pale by comparison. And I'm sure we'll talk about many of them at later dates. But it's almost looks like they got buried next to him. But really, in his own mind, he was being buried next to them.
So why was he such a big deal?
Well, let's go ahead and start with the situation of scholarship in his day. So the Talmud had been completed and disseminated, give or take, depending upon final editions, anywhere between 300 and 500 years prior to RamBam. And the Talmud was this major attempt to provide a elucidation into the Mishnah and to provide the tools, the mental apparatus to analyze any text and to reach a legitimate Jewish conclusion, no matter what the circumstances.
It's probably a good point to ask you what the Mishnah is. Can you give us like
it's a good point. Let's you can always put this in different sequence if you want. So the Mishnah itself is the earliest compilation that was written down of the oral law. That is to say, of the received tradition and analysis of how to actually live a life according to Torah. The Torah itself is a very short book. I know not everyone thinks that when they first think Torah, but it's actually not a very big book. And it doesn't go into a great deal of detail in and of itself for most things. And the oral law was the record among the sages of how we actually unpack all of the teachings of the Torah so that we can do them. So, when it says to return a lost object, it goes into much more detail about exactly under what circumstances, what counts as lost, how hard do you have to return, where do you have to return, all of the questions that come up in a practical life. And they do it by analyzing the way the Torah is written and by then transmitting that analysis and that tradition to the next generation, and the Mishnah was the first attempt to systematically write down this compilation of oral teaching in anything like a systematic way. Prior to that, there would have been study notes among some students, and there would have been oral publications. That is to say, people would have learned huge quantities of Rabbi so-and-so taught this and Rabbi so-and-so taught that, but to have it all down in one place and that could be copied and then transmitted, the Mishnah was really the groundbreaker on that. And the Talmud came along because, like the Torah, the Mishnah is kind of short. It's longer than the Torah, but still kind of short. And it needs more explanation and elucidation. And so the Talmud came along in the next few generations to give that work. And the Talmud was the last universally accepted book among the Jewish people to say this is something that we consider authoritative. The problem is, as you can maybe detect a pattern, is that as soon as the Talmud came out, there needed to be more commentary about what the Talmud meant. So you have commentary about the Talmud, which was commenting about the Mishnah, which was commenting about the Torah, which is essentially a commentary on life and God. And it began to snowball more and more. It's like a roll of paper. The first roll is very small, but every successive roll makes the new rolls get even bigger. And you end up in RamBam's time, like I said, 300 to 500 years after the Talmud had been finished, with a huge mass of uncollated and unwieldy teachings and decisions and rulings and insights that had been done by rabbis all over the world for hundreds of years. And that was Judaism. And RamBam looked at this and went, how is anybody supposed to know what to do? Because most of the people were simply doing what they had been told or what they had seen their parents or their community do. They couldn't dig through this giant ball of teachings and decisions and everything, because there was no organization to it. It was just like having an armful of papers and saying, your answer's in there, go for it. So RamBam began by writing a commentary on the Mishnah to, in a sense, bypass the Talmud. He wanted people to study the Mishnah itself rather than studying the Mishnah only through the lens of the Talmud. And his commentary was an attempt to get people to see that the Mishnah itself spoke for itself, and that while the Talmud was important for handling the tricky bits, you could do an awful lot with just the Mishnah, and that he wanted to make the Mishnah more manageable. So then people would only need the Mishnah and his commentary, and they would be in good shape. That was his idea. Didn't work out so well, but his commentary was very important for another reason as well, because he followed a pattern that had become common in both the Christian and the Muslim world, which was to enumerate some of the main points, the main principles that were the hallmark of faith, a sort of litmus test, if you will, of what Jews believed, which was really one of the first times this had been put down into paper.
The 13 principles.
Exactly, the 13 principles of faith. We can probably do a whole nother show just on those 13, or each one in turn. But the idea of having this list was really sparked by the phrase in the Mishnah that all Jews have a share in the world to come, except for those. And then the phrases that are used are a little ambiguous of what exactly it means to be a heretic. What does it actually mean to deny Torah? And so RamBam was really answering that question when he wrote his 13 principles. He wasn't trying to say these are the only things Jews should believe. He wasn't trying to say these are necessarily even the most absolutely important and nothing else counts kind of things. He was simply answering the question, what do you need to believe, or what should you avoid not believing, if that isn't too many double negatives, in order to move to the next world after this one. And that was really the gist of it. But it really took on a life of its own.
And now it's the entrance point right into Judaism. If you're coming as a convert, those 13 principles are the things you have to agree on to move forward.
Well, in addition to some others, so those are certainly 13 points that are personal. That is to say, they're not practice in many ways, although they all have practical implications. But someone could keep kosher, someone could keep Shabbat, somebody could study Torah, someone could give tzedakah, they could celebrate all the holidays, and not believe these. And that was really what RamBam was introducing, which was new at the time. Judaism had talked about belief, of course, since the day one, literally. But emphasizing that belief had a practical matter, that it had a practical effect, was really a new emphasis. And to say that, no, you actually need to get your head around these, not just do the commandments, but also understand this at least, if you really want to understand what Judaism is about and to fully be connected to it. And in fact, if you do all the commandments and you don't understand these, you don't connect to them, then you're in trouble. You're not really properly situated within the Jewish world.
And how was his commentary met? If the Talmud was the last book that was really accepted, didn't he seem like a usurper that was coming in and saying, well, actually, you don't have to worry about that because I've got this brand new book?
Oh, yeah. And in fact, the commentary to the Mishnah was moderately accepted because it was good, it was clear. It wasn't quite as audacious as his later book. But his later book, the Mishnah Torah, which he's more famous for, the Yad Chazakah, the strong arm, he very clearly in his introduction said, all you need is the Torah and this, and you're okay. And a lot of people got a little angry at that, to basically say this is the Mishneh Torah, the second Torah, which is literally what it means. People thought that was a little self-aggrandizing, that maybe that was a rather striking thing to put on your dust jacket of the book, you know. But on the other hand, he felt there was a very real need. He realized his commentary didn't do the work that he wanted it to do by itself. So he took this great ball of different papers and books and teachings and letters and everything that had been collected for the last few hundred years and read it and organized it. And he, by every measure and every agreement, had an incredibly logical and systematic mind. It said that he never had to read the same book twice, that he could open a book and point to exactly the passage he was referring to immediately from pulling it off a shelf. And what he did in the Mishnah Torah was to take that huge ball and run it through the computer of his brain and write in clear and lucid Hebrew, in very non-confusing language and very logical and consistent language, exactly what the current state of Jewish observance was up to that point, including things that were no longer operative. So unlike some other commentators, he even covered things like how the temple rituals were performed, even though they hadn't been performed for 1,000 years. But he did it based upon the Mishnah and Talmud and other analysis by other scholars up to his day, and laid it out in crystal clear fashion.
I wonder if he had a photographic memory. There's a thing called, I think it's eidetic memory.
Eidetic, yes.
Eidetic, yeah.
That's the official term for what he had. But again, it wasn't. He had the memory and he had the mind to make use of it. That was the unique juxtaposition. And much of that, again, it's important to know from his setting, was brought about because Islam was going through a similar codification phase, where they were trying to systematically understand life and systematically apply Islam to all corners of life, and to reconcile all of the different teachings that had grown up since Muhammad in Islam. And he saw that pattern, and he saw that process, and he saw the sciences that were exploding in the Islamic world, and basically saw that it was good, and that it was helpful, and that this was providing answers to the average person who couldn't wade through this giant pile of information that was just scattered and uncollected and uncollated. So he really took his cue from his surrounding culture, but ran with it in a way that is just incredible. The Mishnah Torah was lovingly accepted by his own community, and it was wonderfully accepted throughout most of the Middle East and North Africa. When it reached Europe, people liked what he had done in terms of a systematic understanding, and they liked the way that he had collated everything. They did not like the way that he had reduced Jewish knowledge and learning to the score, the total, the bottom line. They felt that as a matter of principle, as a matter of core Jewish value, the importance wasn't just to know the bottom line. The importance was to know why the bottom line was the bottom line, because by knowing why, you actually connected to the ways of our people, and you connected to God.
You show your workings, like in maths.
Exactly right. It's you don't get points on the question unless you show your work. So if people could memorize the Mishnah Torah, they would have a false impression that they understood Judaism and that they understood what was necessary. And many of the commentators and critics of the Mishnah Torah pointed out that although in almost all cases most people agreed with most of his rulings, there were even some rulings they agreed with where they tried to say, look, but if one word were different, and if a student read this without understanding that, without understanding the original discussion in the Talmud or the original points in the Mishnah, or God forbid, didn't know the Torah well enough, they would make a wrong decision when they went to apply this. That understanding is more than just digestion. Or you can't have someone else digest it for you, and then you can understand it by simply reading what they have digested. It's very helpful. And indeed, to this day, the Mishnah Torah, even among those who don't see it as being a binding law code, is always used as a very good commentary for Jewish law and for the Talmud. But there is that very great reluctance to just give it a blank check and say, okay, yeah, that's what the Talmud means. And now I don't need to go bother and read the Talmud, or need to read the Torah, or need to do anything else. It never received that universal acceptance that he was hoping for, which in his mind was a great shame. Which brings us to the Guide for the Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim. Because one of the main reasons why he wrote this wasn't just because people were confused and because there was too much going on, but because he wanted to free them from the tyranny of Talmud study. He felt that everybody was spending so much time studying the Talmud, which wasn't as good as the Mishnah, but not only that, they were spending so much time doing this, they couldn't get past and elevate themselves to the true purpose of study and life, which was philosophy. Now philosophy nowadays is a byword for bearded thinkers sitting in universities and talking about, trees in the forest and all of that sort of thing. Philosophy in this day had a much deeper understanding. And by the way, as someone with a BA in philosophy, I'll point out that's not what modern philosophers do much either. We may do that when we're having a beer, but modern philosophy is a very fruitful and practical discipline. But it was even more central in the minds of the average person, average educated person in the ancient world, as being an important field of analysis, of logic, and of reflection upon how the world was put together and what God was. And he felt that there wasn't enough time being spent on the natural philosophies and the divine philosophies, and what we would now call science and theology. Although theology is perhaps, again, a misleading word, since theology has a stale connotation in the modern world. He really meant spiritual exploration and expansion of the mind. So when he wrote Mishnah Torah, he was hoping that everyone would be able to read the Torah so that they could see God's word, read the Mishnah Torah so they'd understand what it was supposed to mean day to day in their life, put those two books to one side, keep reading the Torah week after week, of course, read the Mishnah Torah when you need to look something up, and spend the rest of your time doing this philosophy into the world and into God. And the Guide for the Perplexed was there to answer some of the questions that happened when people actually did that. And many of those questions are questions that people still have today. Not surprisingly, when you begin to look at the natural world, when you begin to examine the secular sciences, there are passages in the Torah and passages among the words of the sages that on face value seem to have trouble. It says God has a hand. It says God got angry. It says that the world was created at a moment in time rather than eternal, which was what the science of the day claimed, was that the universe was forever. It's important to remember that it wasn't until the 20th century that the idea that the world had a Big Bang became fashionable. And actually the term Big Bang was originally coined as a criticism of the Big Bang theory. There was somebody mocking the idea that the universe began all at once. The universe is eternal. Aristotle said so. Modern scientists weren't claiming Aristotle, but really they were following Aristotle, which was what was the science of RamBam's day as well. And so RamBam said, look, we got a lot of Jewish people that are learning more about the secular sciences and philosophy, and they are turning around and examining Judaism, and they are confused. They are perplexed. So why don't I write a book for those students who have reached that level of confusion that can help explain to them why science and Torah are not in conflict. Why just because it looks like it said such and such in Aristotle or such and such in Torah doesn't mean that the two of them aren't actually doing fine together. So that was his big goal in Moreh Nevuchim, was to make sure that when a student reached the level of perplexity in this conflict between science and Torah, and philosophy and Torah, that they would not abandon either, because he wanted to make sure that they continue to grow in both fields, and he believed they were intimately connected and self-reinforcing.
And those his writings are still regarded today, right? You can go into your bookstore, you can buy these things. They're still used in Jewish study.
Absolutely, absolutely. You can the Guide for the Perplexed is still Jewish Philosophy 101. As a starter point, there have been many commentaries and expansions upon some of his ideas, but it's still the baseline place to go when you realize that an overly anthropomorphic view of God is not actually what Judaism is comfortable with. Or once you realize that an overly anthropomorphic view of God has difficulty standing up to basic logical analysis. When you reach a point where you say, how could God have a hand? How can God see? Does God have eyes? As soon as you begin answering those questions, the Guide for the Perplexed is still ground zero, or because of the way he wrote in that classical way, books about the Guide for the Perplexed are still ground zero for most people who aren't comfortable reading that style of writing from the Middle Ages. And it had a huge influence not just on Jewish philosophy, but also Muslim and Christian philosophy. Thomas Aquinas borrowed heavily from RamBam's works when he began to introduce a systematic philosophy into Catholicism, and to also avoid some of the, shall we say, looser philosophical models that had existed prior to that. And so for three faiths, RamBam became a very important figure for moving philosophy and understanding into the next level. Or as he put it, not moving it to the next level, but making sure that more people understood what was already there. One of his very big goals was to make sure that people saw in his writings a clarification of the writings of the sages. So he did not feel that he was arguing with the Talmud or arguing with Midrash or arguing with Mishnah. He felt that he was simply explaining it in modern language, that is to say, the language of philosophy, in a way that more people would be able to understand who had studied the modern philosophy, but hadn't seen that it was paralleled in its ideas in the classical texts.
It seems to me that things after RamBam were very different to things before RamBam. Is it fair to say that he created modern Jewish thought?
Ooh, that's a huge title. I will say he was one of the primary shapers of modern Jewish thought. RamBam really stood at this moment, and together with a number of other scholars who will go over, I'm sure, ensured that Judaism that may have been common among the common folk, that is to say, a sort of folk tradition, doing as you're told, but not really understanding, a fairly superstition-laden type of faith, was not the only form of Judaism that was recorded. And instead that Judaism aspired and contained much higher ideals and much deeper thoughts, and that those should be the primary focus of everybody within the faith. And that really, began a process, like I said, together with a few other scholars around this same time period, that reintroduced more and more of the average people to the true genius and beauties of Judaism, which had kind of become beyond their reach at this point. Like I said, it was a tangled mass that was very inaccessible to a layperson, and really he, along with a few others, put Judaism back into the average person's grasp and told them what benefit there was in it, what glory awaited for them in this type of study and understanding. So absolutely, this period with Rambam at the center of it is one of the watershed moments in Jewish history. Even those who disagreed with Rambam, because his Guide for the Perplexed was burnt in many parts of Europe, where it was thought to go too far in the reconciliation between science and faith. But even those who disagreed with him, even those who wrote scathing commentaries, passage after passage, pointing out where he was wrong in their opinion on all sorts of issues, adopted his style and adopted his methodology. And so he may not have been the universal savior of Jewish knowledge and of learning that he wanted to be, and thought that his works had the potential to be. But he was a universal figure in the sense of, after Rambam, there is a very different style to Jewish writing. It is not just loose commentary, it is not just loose texts, although we still have those. But you begin to see more and more books, more and more collected, organized, systemic approaches to all sorts of topics in Judaism. It's the beginning of sort of a great Jewish publication revolution. And like I said, the Talmud had been finished, and there were a few books published by the Gaonim, the great sages of the community that had been in Babylon. But you didn't get a lot of independent books written by a lot of people. And after Rambam, the printing press is a bit anachronistic, but the printing process, the scribal arts of making copies of more and more books really began to come up. And that has a huge lasting impact on Judaism to this day.
So we can be grateful not only for him having a great mind and a great scholarly outlook on life, but also for being born in an era where the technology was catching up with what he needed.
Like so many things in life, it's not just having the right person, it's also having the right person at the right time. If he had been born 500 years earlier, he would have been a sage of the Talmud, but he would have been just in the Talmud. And if he had been born 500 years later, God knows what would have happened to us if we hadn't had somebody to begin to really set a benchmark of what good, clear scholarship looked like.
Wonderful. Well, there you go. That was a whip crack of a rundown of RamBam. If you want to learn more, go on the internet. It's full of great information. Chabad, Aish, all the great Jewish sites have an infinite amount of information. And go and check out some of his publications. If you can make sense of them, let me know.
One other site for people to recommend looking at, the Jewish Encyclopedia. If you haven't already found this wonderful free resource, this was an encyclopedia that was written, I believe, in the early 1900s, and is in the public domain now. And there is a full website that has all of its original articles. Some scholarship has continued to advance, and there are some things that have changed thanks to archaeology or new research and new findings. But it is still a great place to begin a Jewish understanding of many, many topics and many of these people. So
awesome.
Jewish Encyclopedia, yeah.
I'll have a link under the video. Thanks very much, Rabbi Neely. I appreciate that very much. It's great.
All right, thanks.
So we'll be back very soon with our next sage. I think we know who it's going to be, but I'm not going to say it just in case it isn't, and it spoils the whole timetable of things. So thanks very much for watching. Give the video a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. Make sure you head over to Rabbi Neely's channel. There'll be a link under that as well. He does amazing weekly programs on the Torah portion and on Mishnah at the moment, which have been fantastic. So you can go over there and check those out. I'm enjoying them. And we'll see you all again very soon. Bye-bye.